Chapter 1. The City on the Hill. Sputtering torches gave off a flickering orange light that darted across the walls, while a freezing wind whistled eerily through the cavern. This, combined with low ceilings and thick shadows, gave anyone entering the Goblin Palace a sense of unease. And, on this occasion, 3 centuries after the Goblin War, anyone who was anywhere near the throne room had good reason to feel uneasy. Goblano, king of goblins, was not feeling very patient today. The golden crown atop his scruffy black hair was covered in patches of moss. As the centuries passed, there was more and more of it. Between his eyes and down his left cheek was a pale scar tinted with the blue of goblin blood. Down his back was a long crimson cape that flowed majestically behind him when he strode through the halls of the Goblin Palace. His diamond-encrusted chainmail glittered in the torchlight, while the pitch-black breastplate upon his chest seemed to absorb most of the light in the room. "She what?" Goblano demanded, glaring at his soldier, who was crouching, terrified, on the ground.
My lord, the girl, she escaped."
Goblano stared at the goblin, sighing exasperatedly. He pointed his hand at the failed servant, enjoying the terror that filled the goblin's eyes as he realized what was about to happen.
No, my lord, give me another chance,"
the goblin pleaded. Goblano shook his head. "Crevet!" The goblin slumped to the floor, dead. Without a second glance, Goblano turned to General Mowlith, who stood next to the throne. Mowlith was tall and stocky, with shaggy dark hair and a hardened expression. Several daggers hung from his belt. As he stepped forward, he moved almost silently. Goblano leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "Gather an army and use whatever means necessary to bring me Mara Edkul." 10 goblins surrounded Howard Zaltho. They brandished large axes and crossbows, which made the short sword in Howard's hand seem insignificant. "Give up, boy," ordered one of the goblins, "or we'll have no choice but to end you." Howard's fist tightened around the hilt of his sword. He had trained all his life for this. "I'm not afraid of you," he responded. And he leapt toward the goblins, raising his blade above his head, ready to swipe it through one of their necks and... "Zaltho, pay attention!" The grassy plain transformed into the Kolnathalawan library, and the goblin became Howard's teacher, Mrs. Leprum. Its axe turned into a hefty stick that Mrs. Leprum used to aggressively point at a blackboard. Bookshelves that were several stories high lined the floors, and the large windows along every wall allowed vast streams of sunlight swirling with dust to speckle the room. Howard sat at a wooden table, suffering through his morning history lesson. Mrs. Leprum liked to keep the windows closed, causing the room to become hot and stuffy. Howard's mind kept drifting away from memorizing lists of names to killing goblins. Howard was tall and had light brown hair that went down to the nape of his neck. His forest green eyes were kind, and when the sun shone, his large nose cast a shadow over the bottom of his face. Howard was fairly thin and muscular, on account of all the time he spent running around Kolnathalawan, pretending to fight off a goblin army. "Your family has been full of scholars for generations. I can't understand why you don't do your work. Don't you want to follow in your family's footsteps?" exclaimed Mrs. Leprum. Mrs. Leprum was ancient. Howard's father, Christopher, who was Kolnathalawan's head librarian and one of King Adam's chief advisors, told him that she had been his teacher growing up. She was much shorter than Howard, and her graying hair was beginning to thin. However, even as her body aged, her mind remained as sharp as it always had been. She often recounted tales of the good old days, of King Edward nearly 60 years ago when she herself was a child. Howard looked at Mrs. Leprum indignantly. "My ancestors were once some of Theldin's most revered warriors. Like Thomas Zaltho, He fought in the Goblin War. I'd like to follow in his footsteps."
"But Howard, the Goblin War is over. We have a peace treaty with Gablano. You can't be a warrior," she chided.
"Not now. But someday, maybe." Mrs. Leprum sighed.
"You're too young anyway. A boy like you battling goblins."
"People my age used to fight. King Bartholomew enacted a draft that—"
"Enough, Howard. I won't have any more of this talk. Your job is not to battle goblins. Your father was adamant that you learn the history."
"I do learn history," Howard interjected.
"You learn only what you want to learn. There's so much more to our kingdom than the Goblin War. For example, I'm still awaiting your essay on the outcasts."
"It's almost done," Howard lied. Suddenly, a knock sounded on the library door. Mrs. Leprum huffed angrily.
"Why do I even bother with you? I should tell your father that you're a hopeless case,"
she grumbled as she walked toward the door. As soon as Mrs. Leprum had turned the lock, a boy who was about Howard's age burst through the door and barreled into her. "Come on, Howard! I'm here to get you out!" he cried, reaching his hand toward Howard. Howard recognized his best friend, Oliver Franklin, of course. The two boys had known each other ever since their mothers had died. Howard grinned, grabbing Oliver's hand and bolting toward his freedom before Mrs. Leprum could close the door.
"Boy, when your father hears about this—"
Mrs. Leprum's voice was cut off as Oliver slammed the door shut. Together they sprinted through the halls, cackling as the library disappeared behind them. Colnathaluan Castle was an impressive marble citadel, enclosed within a thick, round wall, encircling the top of the lofty hill on which the castle sat. Small turrets and battlements dotted the wall, but most impressive were the 4 guardian towers, huge marble spires with navy blue roofs in the 4 corners of the wall. They were so tall that the entire city was visible below them. The rest of the castle, floors and floors of dungeons, personal quarters, guard barracks, forges, and more, curled around Colnathaluan Castle's 5th largest spire, King's Tower. In front of this tower was a large, roughly circular courtyard in which the king could address the city. The castle was on the uppermost of 4 tiers that made up the city. Below it, on the 3rd tier, lay the manors of Colnathaluan's richest inhabitants, as well as a handful of academies. The most prominent of these was the aptly named Wizard School, where sorcerers came to be trained in the ways of magic. Of course, the school only housed 100 or so students at a time. Magic was exceedingly rare. Those who had it were thought to be blessed by the gods. After all, it was supposedly the gods' own power that sorcerers harnessed. On Tier 2 were the shops, parks, taverns, and any other business that served the general public. And on the largest, bottommost tier were the houses of Colnathaluan's less affluent citizens. Each of these tiers had their own set of streets that stretched within them. However, they were all connected by the snaking middle road, which spiraled all the way from the city's main gate to the castle. Howard and Oliver kept running until they reached the Royal Gardens, a ring-shaped arboretum that occupied the space between Colnathaluan Castle and its defensive wall. They collapsed onto a stone bench, panting.
"Did you see Leprum's face when I opened the door right in her face? She looked like she'd seen a ghost."
Oliver's grin covered his entire face and lit up his brown eyes with glee, a characteristic that could make even the grumpiest guard crack a smile. Howard laughed as well. "Thanks for that. I thought I was going to be trapped in that prison forever." "Wait a minute. Why weren't you there today? Mrs. Leprum told me not to come today. She said you were falling behind and that there was no point in teaching us both until you caught up." "So you knew that I was going to be alone with her and still waited almost an hour before rescuing me?"
"Well, you know how adamant your father was that you learn the history of our great kingdom," Oliver mocked.
Even though he was only 13 years old, 3 years younger than Howard, Oliver was immensely clever, and Howard's father had insisted the two be educated together. Despite being nearly a foot shorter than most boys his age, Oliver was very strong. His short blonde hair barely went past his ears, and his stout figure made him slightly slower than Howard, but no less resilient. "You're ridiculous, you know that?" Howard scoffed, but his lips curled into a smile. "Now that we both have the rest of the day free, want to go to the beech grove? Sounds good to me." The beech grove was located on the second tier of Culnathalluan, inside the verdant Swallows View Park. These trees had been a gift to Culnathalluan from the goblins, planted at the end of the Goblin War as a sign of friendship. Now, 3 centuries later, the beech grove served as a hideout for Howard and Oliver. It had been a warmer spring than usual, and thus the stone-lined dirt path that wound lazily through Swallows View Park was more crowded than it normally was. Howard and Oliver passed couples walking arm in arm, mothers holding their children's hands, and every manner of people as they made their way to the beech grove. 12 trees stood in a wide ring, their trunks sturdy and branches thick, creating a web of leaves and limbs that threw dancing shadows about the grove. In the middle of the grove was a large pond. It was in the shape of a tall oval, bisected by a square with a circle in the middle of it, creating the shape of an eye, the goblin crest. The water was tinted with magic. The pupil of the eye was red, the square in the middle was white, and the rest was a deep green. Howard and Oliver surveyed the pond from above as they climbed to the uppermost branches of one of the beech trees, having their usual argument. "I'm just saying, this is a human city," asserted Howard. "Not just that, but it's the capital of a human kingdom. Why have the emblem of our enemies here?" Oliver cautiously settled himself into a seated position. "I think," he mused, "it's a show of good faith. The goblins gave us these trees, and I suppose having the goblin crest here is our way of thanking them. It just doesn't feel right. Even though the war is over, there's still traces of them. Maybe it's the goblins' way of letting us know that they're always watching," said Oliver in a dramatic voice. "Maybe so," Howard chuckled. They had been having this debate for years at this point. It was almost a ceremonial conversation rather than a legitimate discussion. "So, Oliver, have a nice morning while I was in lessons?" Howard narrowed his eyes for the last bit, making sure his friend got the full force of his feigned contempt. Oliver shrank back with equal theatricality. "Like I said, she asked me not to come in today. You know there's nowhere I'd rather be than that stuffy library, listening to Mrs. Leprum drone on and on. Well, you missed a truly fascinating lecture. Today we learned about the utter irresponsibility and sheer lack of drive of one Howard Zaltho. Now I wish even more I'd been there, hearing Mrs. Leprum's angry screeching. I envy you, my friend. Maybe this afternoon you, Oliver Franklin, can return to the library and experience it for yourself," Howard grinned. "Oh, I challenge thee to a duel. A duel! Excellent. What are we dueling for? If I win, I get to skip tomorrow's lessons, and you have to deal with Mrs. Leprum alone. If you win, I'll do all your chores for a week. What do you say?" Oliver stroked his chin, pretending to think very hard. "I accept your challenge." The boys clambered back down the tree to the ground, where they searched for sticks that were long and sturdy enough to use as swords. Just as they found their weapons, they were interrupted by the sound of clanking metal coming toward them. They froze, confused. But their confusion was dispelled a moment later when a group of 30 or so fully armored knights came running down the path past the beech grove. Leading these knights was a tall, bulky man in dark gray armor, which was a stark contrast from the glistening silver of the other knights. Unlike the others, he did not wear a helmet. A pale, jagged scar on his cheek stood out against the bright red goatee on his chin. His hair was pulled into a bun atop his head. It was General James, leader of the Theldinian army. "General!" Oliver called. James saw them and waved. "Keep running," he told his troops. 5 laps around the park. We've got to get you all accustomed to this armor." The knights continued down the path, their clangor fading into the distance. James strode into the beech grove, smiling. "Oliver Franklin and Howard Zaltho. What are you two up to on this fine afternoon?"
"We were about to duel," Oliver exclaimed.
"For honor," added Howard. "That sounds exciting. Mind if I watch?" The boys shook their heads. "All right. Let's get started, then," James began, asserting himself as a referee. "Shake hands, you two." Howard and Oliver shook each other's hands, then stepped back several paces and raised their sticks, readying themselves. "Begin." Howard and Oliver charged and swung at each other. Their sticks collided with a loud crack. Oliver, stunned, hesitated, which Howard took advantage of by sweeping his weapon under Oliver's legs. Oliver fell on his back, but managed to roll out of the way of Howard's next attack. For several minutes, the boys ran around the beech grove. They climbed and jumped out of trees and forced each other backwards, sticks hitting sticks as they performed the much-practiced footwork they had discovered once in a book years ago. Oliver could feel Howard steadily pressing him backward. He was older and stronger. It made sense. But still, it was frustrating. And Oliver was not going to give up easily. He steeled himself to push forward. The back of his heel caught on a rock, and Oliver toppled backward, right into the pond. James laughed heartily. "I think that's enough for today, don't you?" Howard offered Oliver his hand, pulling him out of the pond. "You okay?" he asked. Oliver nodded. His pride was bruised, but otherwise he was unhurt. "That was an excellent fight to watch," complimented James. "Have you boys studied swordplay formally?"
"No," Howard explained, "but we found a book in the library that detailed all the different moves and everything. We've been practicing for years," added Oliver. "We want to become knights eventually."
"Well," James smiled, "I could certainly use fighters like you in my army. Keep at it." Howard and Oliver beamed. James was one of their biggest heroes, and this praise from him meant a lot. "Now off you go," he said, shooing them out of the beech grove. "I've got to get back to work, and I'm sure Christopher is wondering where you two are." Howard and Oliver cautiously opened the door to their quarters. After his and Howard's mothers had drowned in a swimming accident, Oliver had moved in with the Zalthos and had essentially become a part of the family. Their carefulness was to no avail, though. The entry room of the Zalthos' quarters was a sitting room containing several oil lamps and armchairs. A bookshelf stuffed with various tomes stood against one wall. At the far end of the room, seated in a chair facing the door, reading what looked like a mystery novel, was Christopher Zaltho. He wore a simple, lilac-colored tunic, with a pipe in the breast pocket. His long brown hair was tied back in a ponytail, and he had a short beard. "I was beginning to wonder if I'd ever see you boys again," he said sternly.
Howard stammered. "We were with General James," Oliver offered. "He wanted to see our sword skills."
"I'm glad you got some practice in, but that doesn't change the fact that you both owe Mrs. Lepram an apology. You boys are very fortunate to get to study in a place with so many academic resources."
"Technically, I didn't have to be in lessons today," Oliver argued, "so I didn't do anything wrong."
"Didn't you interrupt Howard's lesson?"
"Oh, right."
"Now both of you, go get washed up before supper. The stew's almost done." Howard and Oliver sighed and started toward their rooms. "Oliver, why are you all wet?" Christopher called after them.
"James wanted to watch me and Howard duel, and I fell into the pond in the beech grove."
A slight smile crossed Christopher's face. "What did James have to say about the duel?" Howard grinned widely. "He said we were excellent." "I'm sure you were. I'm glad my boys are doing me proud." He forced his face back into a serious expression. "That doesn't change the fact that what you did today was irresponsible and unacceptable. Go get changed into some dry clothes and come into the dining room." The boys left, feeling chagrined, but not altogether unhappy. Christopher busied himself in the kitchen, somewhat reluctantly breaking into a grin. King's Tower was several stories high and large enough to house an entire family. It did, in fact. Theldin's royal family. King Adam and Queen Helena, along with their 6 children, resided in the imposing spire. It featured, among other rooms, an ornate dining room, multiple sleeping quarters, a private library, and an entire room devoted to storing the royal family's wine. Queen Helena scanned the shelves of that room, searching for something to drink. She settled on a rosé from one of Culnithalawan's own vineyards. As she crossed to the dining room and poured the wine into an ornate goblet, she felt a cool breeze brush past. Her long auburn hair, usually kept in a tight, elaborate braid, now hung freely down the back of her blue nightgown, fluttering in the wind. Turning around, Helena spotted her husband standing out on the tower's balcony. Smiling, she called to him, "Want some company?" King Adam turned around, a smile on his face. "From you?" "Always." Helena poured another goblet of wine, then joined her husband on the balcony. The last vibrant colors of twilight were fading into the muted tones of night. Adam, tall and stocky, gazed out at his kingdom. He was garbed in a white silken shirt and brown trousers, and a golden crown beset with sapphires sat on top of his short red hair. "We're so lucky to be where we are, Helena," Adam breathed after taking a sip of wine. "The city is beautiful, our people are happy, and Theldin is safe." "We couldn't have done it without such a strong leader," Helena said, reaching up and stroking Adam's goatee. "Ah, but where would a leader be without his family? I owe everything to you." Helena smiled, wrapping her arms around one of Adam's. "I love you. I love you too, my dear." They sat together in silence for a few minutes, breathing in the cool air and enjoying the closeness. Helena sat up suddenly. "Something isn't right down there." "What do you mean?" Adam asked, puzzled. "I'm not entirely sure, to be honest, but something feels wrong." The king and queen peered down at the sprawling city below, which was illuminated by lanterns hung throughout the streets. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, except— "Look!" cried Helena, pointing to the outermost edge of the city. "I don't see anything." Adam squinted down into the darkness. "Exactly. It's completely dark over there. None of the lanterns are lit." "Maybe someone simply forgot to light them," Adam suggested nervously. But even as he spoke, he saw that the darkness was spreading throughout Culnithalawan. One by one, the lanterns were going out. They were startled by a sudden banging coming from behind them. King Adam took a deep breath and went inside to get the door. He opened it to reveal General James. "It's goblins," he exclaimed breathlessly. "Are you certain?" Adam gasped. "Who else would it be? Who else would trespass in our city under the cover of night?" "You seem to forget that we have a treaty forbidding goblins from entering Culnithalawan, James." James snorted. "Gablano doesn't give a damn about the treaty, Your Highness. He's been violating it for decades." "Be careful that you don't allow your bias to cloud your judgment," Adam warned. "I know you have a history with the goblins. I have no love for their kind either, but we can't jump to conclusions about—" He was cut off by a sudden explosion of light. Several buildings below had burst into fire. Even as they watched, the fire was quickly beginning to spread.